Howdy, junior anatomists and physiologists. Welcome to Chapter 6. This is the second video for Chapter 6. We talked about these guys, skeletal system. What we're going to talk about today is the chemical composition of the skeletal system. So this is just a review. I'm showing kind of the flow chart of where bone lies as a connective tissue. So if we come down here, bone is a type of connective tissue, but specifically it's supportive connective tissue, and that makes sense. And then here we are. The other types of supportive connective tissue are cartilage and blood. So this is just a review of the structure of bones. Remember, this is a long bone. And so at the ends of long bones, you have these structures called epiphyses. So there's an epiphysis here and an epiphysis here. And then between the two epiphyses of a long bone, you have that middle portion, or the diaphyses, or you could say it or a lot of different ways. So the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So in this is a cartoon of a living bone. And remember, if you are cartilage and you are covering an articulating surface, that means where a joint is, then you are called articular cartilage. But if I ask you, what is this articular cartilage made of? What type of cartilage? You would say hyaline. And then it just shows the red bone marrow here and the yellow marrow. The periosteum, which is the covering of the bone, remember that's a connective tissue. And then if there's a peri, or on top of, there's an endo, or inside. So the endosteum lines the central or the marrow cavity of the bone. All right, so we're going to talk about landmarks on bones. There's a lot of different landmarks on bones, and when you study the bones, you don't just say this is a vertebra, for example. You'd be asked on a lab practical exam to name the landmarks on the vertebra. So if we look at this vertebra, this part, this is the body of the vertebra. This is the spinous process of the vertebra, so that you can kind of feel those spinous processes if you just feel your vertebra. And then lamina, lamina just means plate, so this plate kind of connects the spinous process to the rest of the vertebra. And then, let's see, in addition to a spinous process, you have these transverse processes, and then you have these facets. So there's a lot of facets. So there's a superior articular facet, superior costal facet, inferior costal facet, transverse costal facet. So these facets are just places on the bone where other bones can fit. And where one bone fits into another bone, you probably know that's called a joint. So a facet then is a smooth, flat, articular surface. So if it's an articular surface, that just means that it forms a joint. And the example that I'm showing you are these facets on vertebra. And we'll talk more about how these facets on the vertebra form joints with the ribs when we do the trunk, the bones of the trunk. Processes that form attachments for connective tissue. So that would be this, in terms of the vertebra, that would be this spinous process. So it's a process or a projection, because it projects out from the body of the bone. And this is where connective tissue will attach. So connective tissue like a tendon that will attach the muscle to the bone. So this cartoon just shows the vertebral and sternal articulations or joints of a typical vertebra and rib. So for example, it shows, so here's a vertebra. Okay, and then here's another vertebra here. And this piece right here, we were talking about facets for forming joints. This is the superior costal facet, and it forms a joint with the head of the rib. So then you can see here, here's this piece is the head of the rib, and then here's the neck of the rib. Here's a little projection, a tubercle of the rib, and then this is the angle of the rib where it bends here. But the head of the rib articulates with the superior costal facet of the vertebra. So this is the way you should study the way the joints are, or the way the bones fit into one another. You don't want to just say a rib fits into a vertebra. You want to say the head of the rib, so now you're talking about one bone, the head of the rib articulates with the superior costal facet of the vertebra. Okay, more landmarks on bone. So this is, we'll look at landmarks on the femur, and then I have these landmarks circled in green. So these are processes that form joints that you find on the femur. So let's look at the first one. Here's the head of the femur. So the head of the femur is described as a round articular, so that means it's going to form a joint. If you see that word articular, think joint. A rounded articular projection. So you can see that the head is projecting, it's actually projecting from the neck. And the head is supported on a neck. So usually if you find a head landmark on a bone, there will be a neck landmark as well. So more processes that form joints, condyles. So on the femur, you come down here and you can see at the distal end of the femur, you have a lateral condyle. And if you have a lateral something, you most likely are also going to have a medial of that same thing. So here's the medial condyle. So remember now, you'd want to talk about these condyles because there could be condyles on other bones. This is the lateral condyle of the femur. This is the medial condyle of the femur. So a condyle then defined is a large rounded protuberance at the end of a bone. So this is the distal end of the femur, of the bone, where you find this large projection or protuberance called a medial condyle and a lateral condyle. And these medial and lateral condyles will articulate with the tibia, which is the leg bone. So again, we'll use the femur as an example. Let's look at processes that form attachments for connective tissue. Remember that connective tissue is usually in the form of a tendon that's connected to a muscle. So if you have a condyle, a medial condyle, you can look for an epicondyle. So remember, epi means on top. So that's this little piece here. So there's a medial epicondyle, and then there's a lateral epicondyle of the femur. And those are projections just above the condyle. And they'll form attachments. So there's these raised portions of bone that are kind of rough, and they form attachments for connective tissue in the form of a tendon that's connected to a muscle. And then also using the femur as an example, you have this thing called a line. So it says a spiral line right here of the femur. It's a long, narrow ridge or border on a bone. And then also a line is the linea aspera on the femur. So you can see in this cartoon, you can see that it looks like a ridge, right? So it's a ridge on the femur. And then the trochanter is just a really big projection. And there is here in this cartoon, it shows the greater trochanter of the femur. If there's a greater something, there's going to be a lesser something. So here's the greater trochanter of the femur. Here's the lesser trochanter of the femur. And again, those are attachments for connective tissue. And then that connective tissue is usually in the form of a tendon, which is attached to a muscle. More landmarks on the bone using the femur as an example. A fovea is just a small pit, and so you kind of see this little circle. There's a fovea capitis of the femur, so it's on the head of the femur. So now let's look at the humerus. So that's your arm bone. Let's look at some examples from that. So processes that form joints on the humerus. Again, there's a condyle. So if we come down here, this is tricky because the condyles on the humerus are named something else. So the condyle on the humerus, it's still a large rounded protuberance at the end of the bone, so it's at the distal end of the bone. But the capitulum here and the trochlea here are the condyles of the humerus. And if there's condyles, then you know there's epicondyles on top of the condyles. So there's a lateral epicondyle. So this lateral epicondyle of the humerus is on top of the condyle, aka the capitulum of the humerus. And then this medial epicondyle is on top of the condyle, aka the trochlea of the humerus. And they're going to form joints. So they'll form joints with the radius and the ulna, your forearm bones. Processes that form joints on the humerus would include a head. So there's a head of the humerus, and then it's kind of interesting on the humerus there's two necks. There's an anatomical neck here, and then there's a surgical neck here, a little lower than the anatomical neck. You have the surgical neck, and that must be important to clinicians or anatomists, which I am neither. So those are processes that form joints. And then on the humerus, processes that form attachments for connective tissue would be the epicondyles on the humerus. And then also these things called tubercles. So there is a greater tubercle. So if there's a greater tubercle, you're going to find a lesser tubercle here. And that's where the tendons will attach to the humerus, and then those tendons will attach to muscles. Okay, let's look at the tibia. Processes that form joints. Again, we have some condyles. So you have so this is the tibia here, and then this is the fibula. So there's a medial condyle. If there's a medial condyle, you're going to get a lateral condyle, and you'll form joints with your medial and lateral condyle. Because this is the proximal end of the tibia, you'll form a joint with a femur here with the medial and lateral condyles. Processes that form attachments for connective tissue in the form of tendons that attach to muscles would be a tuberosity. So you find here this thing, the tibial tuberosity. It's just kind of this rough projection off the tibia, and you'll find tendons there that connect to muscles. Let's use the humerus again to look at fossa. So a fossa is a shallow basin, and the example of a fossa is the coronoid fossa of the humerus. So you come down here, here's the coronoid fossa of the humerus. So it's just this kind of shallow basin. So there's a coronoid fossa, and then there's a radial fossa of the humerus. Let's use the humerus to look at a sulcus. A sulcus is a groove, so it's like a furrow along a bone surface. So between the greater tubercle and the lesser tubercle, you find this intertubercle sulcus, or this kind of furrow along the bone surface. And in a sulcus, you can find blood vessels and nerves, and then tendons and ligaments can also sit there. Okay, let's look at the os coxae, or the hip bone, to look at processes that form attachments for connective tissue. So there's this crest on the ilium. So basically, this is the ilium bone. And actually, goes down through here. Here's the ilium. And there's an iliac crest. It's a prominent ridge. And that's an attachment for connective tissue using the form of tendons attached to muscles. So this hip bone, or aka the os coxae, includes the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. All right, so in this cartoon, it looks like they've got the skull bone, and they basically just took off the top of your skull and looked inside for landmarks on bone. So a foramen or a foramina is just an opening for blood vessels, nerves. You can have tendons there too. So here's an optic foramen, for example. So this is where the optic nerve can travel. There's a jugular foramen, this little opening here, the jugular vein. And then this big one, the foramen magnum. So magnum, of course that means big. Foramen magnum, that's where your spinal cord exits. And then you have other landmarks on bones, like a meatus, which is like a canal. So it's a tube-like opening, and we use the internal and external acoustic meatus, where your ear is. And that must be on the next slide. Yeah, here it is. So here's the external acoustic meatus. And so your ear would overlie this bone structure. Okay, just a review. We talked about these 5 major bone cell types. Osteogenic cells, those are stem cells that can create more bone cells. Osteoblasts make the organic matrix of bone. Osteocytes are mature bone cells. Osteoclasts break down bone and help remodel bone, also help maintain calcium homeostasis. When you break down bone, you put calcium back into the blood. And then the bone lining cells are not shown. So now let's look at the chemical composition of bones, the organic matrix, or the organic component, and the inorganic component. And we're going to use this building a concrete wall as an example to think about bone. Just a couple of fun cocktail facts about bone. Bone is half as strong as steel in resisting compression. So that compression would mean if I had a bone here, well, if this pen were a bone and I was trying to push down on it, that would be compressional strength because it would resist trying to compress it. Bone is as strong as steel when you're resisting tension. So if this pen were a bone and I was trying to pull it apart, that would represent the tensile strength of a bone. Think about building a concrete wall as a metaphor. So these pieces here, these are flexible rebar structures, and that would be like the organic matrix of bone. These would be like the collagen fibers. And then the inorganic minerals would be like these solid concrete blocks between the rebar. So the organic collagen fibers are made of the organic collagen fibers and the inorganic minerals of the solid concrete. So here's a cartoon, just shows a piece of bone. Here's the osteocyte in their lacuna, and then the osteocytes are communicating with each other via these canaliculi. And then they all live in this bone matrix, so all of this is bone matrix, and it's calcified. That means it's got calcium in it. And the calcified bone matrix is the inorganic component of matrix. And then the osteoid, the osteoblast, so here's the osteoblast laying down the organic matrix of the bone called the osteoid. And then once this osteoid gets calcified, it will become hard bone. And then here's some bone lining cells in the cartoon. And then here's the osteoclasts that help break down bone. So the organic components of bone include the cells, all the cells, and this stuff here, the osteoid. And the cells include osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, bone lining cells, and osteoclasts. The osteoid, this piece here that's being laid down by the osteoblast, contributes to bone structure. It's the organic component, so it's got collagen in it, and it provides that tensile strength to the bone so you can't pull the bone apart. It also makes the bone just a little flexible. The inorganic component of bone shows here 65% of bone is inorganic. It's called hydroxyapatite. Mostly it's calcium and phosphate, and it's deposited between the collagen fibers. Remember, the collagen fibers are the organic component. So remember, you lay down the osteoid, that's the organic component that's got collagen in it, and then you'll calcify that osteoid with calcium and phosphate, and then you'll get a hardened bone. So hydroxyapatite is the mineral or inorganic component of bone, and the hydroxyapatite or inorganic component is responsible for the hardness of bone and also the resistance to compression of bone. And then there you go. There's your skeletal system with just the names of the bones and no landmarks. But you know, you got to study the landmarks as well. That's it.